Let's dive right into this explainer, where we're going to impartially unpack some seriously intense history. It's kind of wild to think about, but the late 20th century in Western Europe was completely chaotic. Nations were still reeling from the deep trauma of the Second World War, desperately searching for some semblance of stability. And at the exact same time, they were suddenly slammed with a massive, unprecedented surge in radical extremism.
We've got a fascinating roadmap to get through today. We'll start with echoes of the past, then look at the rise of terror, followed by international shadows. After that, we'll see how the state responds, chart the fall of extremism, and finally, wrap things up with the lingering legacies of all this turmoil.
All right, Section 1, Echoes of the Past, where we're wrestling with authoritarian ghosts. Because, to really grasp the turbulence of the 1970s, you actually have to look backward first. We need to understand how different countries dealt with the awkward, often painful remnants of their fascist regimes.
To frame this, let's look at the concept of pluralism. Basically, this means treating social diversity not as a threat, but as a core democratic asset. This was Spain's absolute desperate goal right after General Franco died in 1975. They had to figure out a way for intensely different identities, like the Basque and Catalan people, to somehow share a single political framework without literally tearing the nation in half. Now, it's absolutely striking when you compare how different countries handled this transition. Spain, they actively chose historical amnesia. They literally created a pact of oblivion and passed an amnesty law just to avoid another devastating civil war. But over in Germany and Italy, the younger generations took a totally different route. They were furious, and they violently protested against all the ex-authoritarians who somehow still held cozy establishment jobs in their newly minted democracies. Just listen to this quote from Ulrike Meinhof. She was a prominent leader of the Red Army faction in Germany, and she famously declared, "The legal system is not for the benefit of the people, but to protect property." To extremist groups like hers, the state hadn't really been reformed at all. They just saw a brutal imperialist machine wearing a shiny new democratic mask. Moving right along to Section 2, the rise of terror and the eruption of violence. Because, as you can imagine, that intense anti-establishment anger, it didn't stay confined to peaceful university sit-ins for very long. So the really crucial question we have to ask ourselves is, what actually triggered this? What specifically pushed these student and labor groups across that massive line into armed urban guerrilla warfare? Well, it wasn't just one single thing. It was effectively a perfect storm. You had this crushing economic stagnation in the late 60s and 70s. Add in the fierce global protests against the Vietnam War, the lingering ex-fascist officials, and a massive disillusionment with mainstream moderate politics. All of these elements combined to create an incredibly fertile breeding ground for groups like the RAF and Italy's Red Brigades to radicalize and recruit. But here's the thing, their end goals were vastly different. The RAF and the Red Brigades were hardcore Marxist-Leninists. Their entire mission was anti-capitalist. They wanted to totally dismantle the imperialist state machinery. Spain's ETA, on the other hand, they were fighting a deeply territorial and cultural war. Their violence was laser-focused on Basque separatism and fighting back against centralized suppression. Which brings us to Section 3, International Shadows, the covert Cold War, because we really can't view these domestic terror cells in a vacuum. They were actual, active pawns on the grand chessboard of the Cold War. Enter the Stasi. The East German secret police functioned as a sort of covert big brother to many of these organizations. Operating with a permanent KGB liaison, the Stasi utilized these extreme left groups as a literal fifth column. Their goal was simple, but incredibly dangerous: destabilize Western Europe from the inside out. The scale of this globally funded network is just mind-blowing. We're talking about providing safe havens across borders, top-tier fake passports, Soviet-made weapons, and sophisticated explosive training. This hidden external pipeline is exactly what allowed these relatively small militant groups to hit highly protected Western elites and NATO targets far above their weight class. Okay, Section 4, the state responds. We're talking about the limits of tolerable violence. Faced with relentless assassinations and hijackings, these Western European states had to launch a massive counteroffensive to survive. Just wrap your head around the sheer scale of the escalation here. During what became known as Italy's terrifying Years of Lead, terror incidents skyrocketed. We're looking at over 2,000 separate attacks in the year 1977 alone.
The sheer, unadulterated chaos of that moment forced the Italian government into enacting some incredibly harsh emergency security measures. Ultimately, these groups pushed it way, way too far. The horrific abduction and murder of Italian Prime Minister Aldo Moro in 1978, and the RAF's brutal execution of Hans Martin Schleyer, these were absolute red lines. They were acts so fundamentally shocking that they entirely alienated the very working-class public that the extremists claimed they were fighting for.
Meanwhile, Spain was walking an incredibly fragile tightrope of its own. After Franco died, they spent years trying to carefully implement a complex system of autonomous communities to appease regional demands. But that rapid devolution almost broke the country, sparking such severe conservative anger that it actually triggered a, thankfully failed, military raid on Parliament in 1981.
So how did the states actually fight back? The contrast is really fascinating. Germany and Italy brought down the hammer of the justice system, maximum security prisons, warrantless searches, and flipping informants. Spain, though, they tried to structurally absorb all that regional anger through a rapid constitutional decentralization. They called it a coffee-for-everyone autonomy model, basically giving everyone a slice of self-governance.
Which leads us into Section 5, the fall of extremism, losing the thread. Because eventually those revolutionary fires of the 1970s did begin to burn out. The downfall essentially happened in three main phases. First, their violence got so extreme that they lost all their public support. Second, state intelligence simply got a lot smarter, effectively using informants to rip these operational cells apart from the inside. And third, the USSR's economy started to tank, which completely cut off that vital Stasi and KGB funding. Without that lifeblood, these networks just splintered and faded. And I want you to check out this specific number, 34%. That's the incredibly impressive vote share won by the Italian Communist Party in 1976. It boldly proved to everyone that legitimate democratic pluralism was a vastly more effective tool for bringing about real change than the Red Brigade's bullets ever could be. Finally, Section 6, lingering legacies, the scars we still see today. Because even though those specific terror cells dissolved, the dramatic political choices made during those tense transitional years, they left a lasting mark. The fallout is highly visible, even in modern times. Fast forward to 2013, and Spain was juggling an astonishing 1,600 political corruption cases. It perfectly illustrates how those wildly rushed, highly localized power structures established during the transition actually ended up breeding a massive, systemic culture of clientelism. Plus, Spain's open-ended territorial model, it remains fundamentally unstable to this day. The very same devolution that prevented a civil war back then has fueled a massive, modern resurgence of Catalan independence movements, mostly driven by bloc statutory reforms and ongoing economic disputes. So, as we wrap up this explainer, we're left with a deeply profound question. Can a democracy truly stabilize its future if it chooses absolute amnesia over historical justice? Did Spain's Pact of Oblivion genuinely save them, or did it merely delay a profound reckoning that modern Europe still has to face? It's a heavy thought, but it goes to show that the ghosts of the past are never really gone. Thanks for exploring this complex history with me today.